Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing many of the critical issues of our time. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, the question for me in this moment is fairly simple. What's the theology to carry us through this moment? What's the theology we want to tuck in the pocket of our heart as we move forward? It's been said that Martin Luther King Jr. often carried around with him Howard Thurman's classic book, Jesus and the Disinherited. In this moment, Thurman's sermon, America in Search of a Soul, seems like a good selection to carry with us for this portion of the journey. It seems like Thurman could have preached this sermon this past Sunday and told us that school is out. Now is the moment of reckoning. What has this nation learned? What are we to do with this cult of inequality, as he put it, that threatens our collective soul? Thurman is preaching to me. What about you, Michael?
Brooks, building on the back of what you brought to this conversation, I'd like to lift up just three enemies of Jesus that Howard Thurman highlights in his section on love and Jesus and the disinherited. On that section, he brings to the forefront that the enemy hindered his movement. He then moved to the enemy that oppresses as a proxy of the oppressor. Last, he looks at the enemy that champions the oppressive empire. The great mystic and theologian called these entities enemies of Jesus. As I was reading, I wondered, what does this have to do with the soul? However, a closer look showed me that these are descriptions of what it looks like for America not to have a soul. He says one who is not welcoming of others and is resistant to the well-being of others is missing a soul. Thurman says that one who sits in a place of power and does not use that power to make life better for others is soulless. Last, the great Howard Thurman says the empire has no soul, and those that place the well-being of empire over the well-being of community is void of a soul. I would like for us to enter this discussion by pointing out to you that there are still opportunities that he also laid out in terms of us encountering these enemies. First, we must be transformed. Second, we must go deeper. And last, we must resist. Whereas empire is being unwelcoming, we must be anti-empire. When the proxy of harm comes along, we must recognize the significance of the moment and look to make connections beyond the empire. And finally, when we must resist empire. Empire is soulless, and anything that aligns with empire is in jeopardy. Brooks, I'm super excited and just fanning out over here and looking forward to hearing more from our highly esteemed guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let me talk about those people that you're fanning out over, and I'm fanning out over as well. Let me introduce our three powerhouse authors and prophetic Christian leaders in the order in which they'll be speaking today. The Reverend Cameron Trimble is the CEO of Convergence, an ecumenical and interfaith congregational consultancy. She serves as a UCC pastor, consultant, a frequent speaker on national speaking circuits, and the author of 6 books focused on spiritual development and leadership. Her preferred mode of travel is flying. She is a licensed pilot. The Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, author of Climate Church, Climate World, serves as special advisor on climate justice to the head of the United Church of Christ, while leading 350 UCC churches in Massachusetts as its conference minister. He preached on the climate crisis in over 400 settings. Jim's preferred mode of travel is more earthbound. When he's not preaching and speaking on webinars, you can find him in Vermont cycling on the endless gravel roads and trails there. Lastly, we have with us the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the visiting professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School. Ordained as an Episcopal priest, she currently serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and the Anglican Communion canon at Newcastle Cathedral in Newcastle, England. Douglas is the author of several books, including the award-winning Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. When it comes to preferred modes of travel, well, she travels in place. She is a spin specialist on the Peloton machine. And so we have quite the array of travel people with us today. We are delighted to have each of you join us for this special time of reflection as we engage these critically important issues. Cameron, if you could start us off.
Well, that was one of the more creative introductions that I've ever been a part of. I thank you for highlighting our favorite modes of travel. That was great. What an honor to be a part of this conversation and to be in conversation with these two extraordinary leaders and visionaries. So I look forward to what I learned from you and then the mischief we might imagine together in the conversation that we weave together. I wanted to start with a story, and then we'll nerd out on theology. I live in a place I never dreamed I would live, in a little town called Wedowee, Alabama, and mostly I thought I never thought I would live in Alabama, a place like that. Malcolm, I'm forgetting that we're neighbors, so we need to connect on that. In this little town, I am surrounded by people who are very supportive of the current political culture and the actions that we're seeing taken by this administration. Most of them are not paying attention. Most of them have voted for and are supporting an agenda that will deeply victimize them. And they're already beginning to feel the effects of that, but they're not affiliating it or associating it with the source that is actually causing these afflictions for them. But it's also this interesting town where there are people who maybe have been born here, who have some connection here, and who went out into the world and had careers and lived in places, and they have come back and have a worldview that one would not assume you would find in a place called Wedowee, Alabama. So I'm playing into stereotype here, as you can sense. I have been blessed to find community in those places, and then I remember walking into the grocery store, our little tiny grocery store here in this town. And I walk in and there's a man, again, the day after the election, who's wearing a t-shirt who says, "Your body, my choice." And in that moment, I was reminded of this incredibly complicated time in which we are living, faced with the ideal of who we have said we wanted to be and the reality of who we actually are. And when I think about the many gifts that Howard Thurman has gifted to us, I think he was particularly clear-sighted about the illusion, the danger of the illusions that we can hold to as a culture, and the necessity for the sake of the soul of us as individuals, but also as a nation in this grand experiment called American democracy, to push through those illusions, to see past the games that we are being asked to play. He's probably most, well, I shouldn't say most well known, but a very commonly known quote from Howard Thurman is, "Look well to the growing edge. All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born." And until recently, I have to confess that I had an underdeveloped theology around worlds that die. I had not really given a lot of thought about what it means to die, to have democracy die, to have the illusion of this care for the common good die, to have the illusion of my contribution and complicity in the systems that we're seeing now erode, what it means to have them die, and Dr. Thurman taught that one of the essential steps, probably the most important of it, is that he says we have to become stripped of the literal substance of ourselves before God. That part of the work that I think is being asked of us now, as we're watching what I would say is the destruction of American democracy. I think we're full throttle into an autocracy or authoritarian system, not autocracy. I think I'll go ahead and say, I think we've got some very terrifying days ahead for what we're in for. And I think that those, the conditions for that were set in place many, many years ago. And I don't want to leave us in a space of despair, but I think we should ready ourselves for this. So to think of ourselves as we have to be stripped to the literal substance of ourselves before God, that especially in this Lenten season, that we have to fully embrace what St. John of the Cross would call the dark night of the soul, to be real about what we're facing into, to see clearly what it is that has been true maybe all along, but now we can't turn away. Meister Eckhart also taught us that if you want the kernel, you have to break the shell, right? There's a way in which we have to break through to be able to birth into these new worlds. And I think that was, in large part the invitation of Dr. Thurman was to see clearly and to let go of the lies there. In the seeing clearly, though, if you think about this sense of the dark night of the soul, then there is a disorientation in that space. As things are falling apart, as we're watching the decline of all of these institutions, we're seeing behaviors from our fellow citizens that reek of misogyny, of racism, of all of the worst impulses really that have been present in our culture, but we have wished to downplay, I suppose, or wish to control in some ways previously. What it requires then of us is a deep grounding within ourselves, a sense of a spiritual maturity that may be unique for this moment in human history, particularly because of the environmental existential crisis with which we're now facing. So the work, I think, before us, as I think about this, is, again, Thurman taught us, he said that there is within every person something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in herself. It's the only true guide that we'll ever have, right? This sense of a reorientation to that still small voice within each one of us that guides us into postures of generosity, of compassion, of kindness, and of creativity that I think are really essential for this particular moment. If I think about the movement of religious institutions at this point and the contributions that congregations in particular could make, I want to encourage us. I don't know that we can stop the destruction that's upon us, but what I do know that we could do is to create what Meg Wheatley would call islands of sanity, or in chemistry we talk about them as islands of coherence, spaces where we come together to practice the best of human behavior and of human values. These places where we come to learn wisdom, to learn how to treat one another with kindness, to learn how to really practice our values of equality and justice and liberty. which Thurman certainly had a lot to teach us. So I could continue and riff on. I've lost all track of time. So maybe I should stop and we'll get other voices and then we can see what we weave together.
Thank you, Cameron. I appreciate that. You've really set the stage for us well. And now we'll invite Jim to further expand that island of sanity and coherence. I like that phrase. I like it.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Brooks and Michael for framing this conversation and for convening the three of us. I'm so honored, Kelly, to meet you and to be here with my longtime friend, Cameron. And I very much look forward to the conversation and responding to any questions that come forward. You know, for 20 years, I've been an advocate for climate justice, and I've been writing and preaching and speaking about what it means for everyone who is alive today, for our generation, whatever generation you're part of, to have a shared vocation. And as it turns out, you and I and everyone who is alive today, we have been given this incredible opportunity to be part of what is the most consequential generation of human beings who have ever lived. The climate crisis places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on every one of us. It urges our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. But that's not an easy ask. At the close of 2015, it seemed as if the miracle of 197 countries signing the Paris Climate Accord was real. 3 years later, when 16-year-old Greta Thunberg went to Davos and spoke truth to power, not only did the most powerful business and political leaders on the planet rank the climate crisis as a top concern, they pondered if Greta was right when she said we had to change everything. Then a year later, a more immediate and personal threat, the COVID virus, upended the lives of billions of people while claiming the lives of 20 million and plunging the world into economic recession. So this was our situation: a worldwide economic recession, universal fear of an invisible personal threat, and a truth-telling 16-year-old kid shouting to the most powerful people in the world that we need to change almost everything. You don't have to read very much Timothy Snyder or Ruth Ben-Ghiat to realize that this is a perfect setup for the rise of both authoritarian leaders and religious fundamentalists. And Howard Thurman was right. 250 years ago, America's founders imagined a country whose people were bound to one another by a common embrace of the principles and practices described in America's Constitution and Bill of Rights, including freedom from tyranny and freedom of religion. Gradually, over centuries, we tested, refined, and applied those principles and practices in new circumstances, and the soul of America began to be revealed. But Howard Thurman was also right when he observed that it wasn't that simple. Eventually, Thurman said, there would be a reckoning. And there have been many: the Civil War, women's suffrage, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and others. While the soul of America is rooted in the principles and practices described in America's Constitution and Bill of Rights, so much of the life of America is expressed in an embrace of rugged individualism, racism, sexism, inequality, extractive capitalism, private material dominance and achievement, and the routinely reinforced fear that each of these corrupt values is under attack. Rarely, if ever, has the tension between the soul of America and the life of America been as great as it is today? With each passing week, the lives and careers and futures of millions of people are being torn from them. And while our particular life and livelihood may not yet be impacted directly, none of us can be confident that we are somehow insulated from the knock on our door, the theft of our online identity, data, and assets, the loss of our job, and worse. Need I remind you of Martin Niemöller's confession? First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. Then they came for the trade unionists. Then they came for the Jews. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak out for me. Yes, the soul of America has been riven, torn by the shredding of the principles and assumptions which for centuries have guided our lawmakers and civil society. In the same way, the earth, our common home, the source of life, the midwife of consciousness, and the foundation of every future. In the same way, the earth's life-sustaining climate has been sacrificed. And so, to what end? So that a handful of unimaginably wealthy companies and their CEOs and shareholders can become still richer? While none of us have asked for it, we have been given life, the gift of life, amidst a polycrisis in which truth and facts and freedom are on the scaffold, while lies and fear and tyrannical power are on the throne. It was 62 years ago that Martin Luther King Jr. declared that America had defaulted on its promissory note to Black Americans. And what did lawmakers do? Seeking to realize the soul of America, a year later, lawmakers passed the Civil Rights Act, and a year after that, they passed the Voting Rights Act. It was 55 years ago that an oil spill in Santa Barbara, a river on fire in Cleveland, and an alarm bell in the form of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, prompted 10% of the American public, 20 million people, to take to the streets on the first Earth Day. And what did lawmakers do? Seeking to realize the soul of America. In a few short months, they created the Environmental Protection Agency and passed the Clean Air Act. 2 years later, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and a year after that, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act. We must come to grips with the fact that we are no longer living in that America. And we must recognize what Martin Luther King, Hannah Arendt, and others warned, that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. In a recent post, Cameron put it this way. She reminded us that justice is not passive. It requires action, voice, and courage. If the soul of America is to be restored, it's up to us, we the people. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Let's be clear, you and I are now living amidst a theological emergency. The question I'm wrestling with is this. Not long after Hitler rose to power, Bonhoeffer organized the Emergency Pastors Seminary, commonly known as Finkenwald. What are we being called to organize now? How can our living truly become seeds so that the future may truly have roots? My ongoing attempts to answer these questions have benefited from the wisdom of many. Chief among them are Timothy Snyder, Rebecca Solnit, and Cameron Trimble. I will put into the chat inspiring resources from each of these. Finally, you may have heard of Bill McKibben's new organization, Third Act, that it's now close to 100,000 participants. One of the working groups is Third Act Faith. I'm on the coordinating committee, and I'll put a link into the chat in case you want to become part of Third Act Faith. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jim, for that capturing of the moment. Action, voice, and courage amid a theological emergency. Thank you. And now we turn to our third and final panelist, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas.
First of all, I'd like to join Jim in thanking both you, Brooke, and Michael, for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation and having the distinct pleasure of meeting both Reverend Cameron Trimble and Reverend Dr. Jim Antal. It really is a privilege to be a part of what is an urgent conversation that we are having today. And I had said at the beginning of our pre-discussions that, oh, good, I'm going last, because I didn't want to be the first to have to dive out there. And now it's like I pulled the short straw, going last. How to follow such wise sharings with us today. But I will humbly try to do that. And let me begin by, in some ways, taking up where Jim left off. And this is this whole notion of course, climate change, environmental justice, climate justice, and make directly the link or explicitly the link between inequality and climate change. For we know that the people who are most socially and economically dispossessed, Howard Thurman's The Disinherited, those who are most marginalized in our societies, the minoritized and the marginalized, are those that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. At the same time, climate change continues to dispossess even further those who are the most dispossessed. And so indeed, we know that the World Bank has reported that 68 to 135 million more people can be pushed into poverty by the year 2030 because of climate change. That's only 5 more years. And we know that the poorest countries, which are the countries that are most impacted, right, by climate change, are also the countries that contribute the least to it. That is, they're the countries that contribute the least to greenhouse gases and all of those things that impact climate change. And so there is an inextricable relationship between what we do with our environment, climate change, and growing inequality, and indeed the inequality gap. And so it is as well that as we speak about environmental justice, we have to speak about the environments in which people are forced to live. That is, environments that more foster death than they do life. The environments that reflect the gross inequality in our communities, in our human creation, right? And so let me talk about that for a moment. Let me talk for a moment about the inequality gap. Now, here's what we know. Economist John Friedman, who is an economist at Brown University, put it this way. He said, when people feel like they don't have a chance, or perhaps even more dangerously, when they feel like their kids don't have a chance, that inequality of opportunity, he says, is, in his words, what really gets people upset. Indeed, that is the case. For what we know is that inequality is the enemy, if you will, is the greatest weakness to a democracy. Inequality is the very soil, the perfect soil for anti-democracy movements. Inequality. That's the greatest threat to our democracy. And I repeat, the perfect soil for anti-democracy movements. Why? Because one, inequality breeds fear, right? The fear that indeed you are going to lose what you have and be further left behind, right? The fear that your children will be as bad off as you are, they'll be worse off than you are. Inequality breeds fear, and anti-democracy movements feed on fear. Anti-democracy movements exacerbate fear so that fear becomes the seed for an anti-democracy movement. Inequality breeds and allows for scapegoating, right? A partner to fear, who can I blame for the situation in which I find myself, right? And so it allows for the kind of scapegoating, the kind of blaming of others, the minoritized, the those who are ethnically, culturally, racially different. Anti-democracy movements thrive on scapegoating, finding someone, some group, an already marginalized, minoritized group to blame for the realities of inequality in which people suffer. And as it does that, right, it masks, when you can scapegoat, it masks the real source of the inequality. It masks the systemic and structural realities that indeed feed and serve inequality. Inequality, even as it breeds fear, as it allows for scapegoating, it is also that seed that gets people looking for, if you will, a savior. Someone that will come in and somehow change their condition, rescue them, save them from the extreme realities of inequality that put them in an environment that nurtures death, not life, for them and their children. That's what we call environmental injustice. And it is this injustice that sources fear, scapegoating, as well as this sort of looking for a savior, this sort of savior complex in all of that. And I don't need to prove this to you because we have seen it. All of that functions as the soil that indeed fertilizes anti-democracy movements, such as that of the totalitarian, authoritarian regime that we see now thriving in our country. And just in case we think that this whole reality of inequality is overblown, let me just let's put some concrete data on this reality, that 67% of the total wealth in this country is owned by the top 10% of this country's earners. The lowest 50% of earners only own 2.5% of the total wealth in this country. The top 1%, and this is what really gets me, right? The top 1% of American earners now control more wealth than the nation's entire middle class. The kind of inequality that indeed seeds anti-democracy movements. Now, here's the other thing that we know. When you have this kind of inequality that feeds on fears, that allows for scapegoating, et cetera, that you also have an erosion of empathy. What I often call empathetic incapacitation. How is it that we cannot see in another our very selves? How is it that we lose the instinct, if you will, for compassion, for kindness, for simply, as I like to say, not wanting to withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself? The inequality that is seeded and breeds fear, scapegoating, etc., most significantly erodes our capacity for empathy. And that empathy is the essence of our very humanity. Empathy is what binds us together as people, and it is what binds us together as a democracy that is presumably committed to the aspiration of equality and justice for all. That can only be possible with a shared humanity. That can only be possible with a collective empathy, right? There's no democracy without that. So this brings us, and I'll move quickly. I'm losing track of time as well, so I'm going to move very quickly through this. That brings us to this notion of the soul of America and the soul of who we are. The soul of who we are is inextricably connected to our very humanity. It is inextricably connected to our ability to have empathetic regard for who we are. If the soul of America is reflected in its greatest aspirations to be a nation where there's equality and justice and freedom for all, then the soul of America depends, as I've said, on our empathetic capacity. Otherwise, there's no democracy. And our soul, our very soul, has been compromised. And so the question for me, or the reality for me, is this. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the two warring souls as he tried to describe the plight of African Americans. Our nation, our soul is at war, I say, with perhaps itself. For we have to decide who we are, and perhaps we have. Because deeply embedded within the DNA of our nation, as Reverend Trimble pointed out, is this notion of American exceptionalism that is defined by hetero-misogynistic, white supremacist reality, where it says only those who fit into those categories can be citizens. Not simply citizens, but are human. Not simply are human, but only those who fit into that category deserves our empathetic regard, and thus deserves to be a part of a democracy and its values, its promise of freedom and justice and liberty for all, and equality for all. That's aspirational. That soul is at war with perhaps, I don't know, another aspect of this nation's so-called soul. It's compromised soul. We have to determine who we want to be and who we're going to be. Perhaps we have, but here's what I know. The soul of those of us who call ourselves church and call ourselves Christian, the soul of those of us who claim to be parts of faith communities should never, never be at war or compromised or in doubt. Because our soul connects us to that power that is greater than ourselves. Our soul connects us to the more of who we claim to be as children of God. And so if our soul is not at war with ourselves, it depends upon faith communities. It depends upon the church. Now we say to call ourselves church is aspirational. It depends upon those who claim to be church to indeed lead the way with courage of soul. You shouldn't have to ask people to have moral courage if they're part of a faith community. With courage of soul to call our nation back to, as Lincoln might say, its better angels, and to not compromise out of fear, compromise with an anti-democracy movement, because such a movement is an assault on our very soul. And I'm going to end here with a quote. I was recently reminded of a powerful observation by Frederick Douglass that provides us some insight into the decline of any democracy, and certainly ours today. And he says, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. What will we quietly submit to? How much of our humanity will we relinquish? How much of our soul will we allow to be corrupted and compromised? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Michael, I think we got the right panelists today. I think we did have we made some good selections. I think we'll pat ourselves on the back for that. Now we've got some time for questions and some engagement to further open our souls and stretch our souls and dive into these important questions that our panelists have brought before us. Michael, can you get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, let me say I almost didn't make it through after Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas finished closing out that tag team sermon. I almost started running around in circles and wasn't going to be on the call. But I'm still here. And so we've got one question here. It says, earth scientists tell us that we are living with the Holocene extinction, a very rapid anthropogenic extinction event. Is the increased human violence combined with denial of this reality our collective response to the ontological shock of this crisis? Do islands of sanity and coherence require honesty about the severity of our predicament? Does our theology address both individual death and species extinction?
I'll jump in first on that. And
I figured you would.
Basically say yes, yes, and yes to those three questions. There is, as the person raising these questions suggests, there is a deep, deep connection between the foundation of all of life, and that rug has, because of climate change, because of our actions that have created climate change, is like the rug being pulled out from underneath the continuity of existence for the past at least 12,000 years, which is the length of the Holocene, that happy part of climate that has allowed civilization to to emerge. And then the connection that the questioner asked, like, well, geez, is that connected with the emergence of, authoritarian the hammer kind of falling on civilization? And my response is absolutely. These two are connected. Resisting, how shall I put this? Um, we must not we must not silo our minds to resist one and not resist the other. We need combined resistance.
We've got another question I want to bring forward from Judith. How do we show empathy for those who believe that MAGA is the answer for themselves, their families, and for their community?
Kelly and I are looking at each
Good.
other.
You go ahead. You go ahead. Because you're living down there in that reality.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how do I love my neighbors is what I'm hearing, and my family. I'll just say this briefly. I was on a webinar last night with two incredible theologians, and a similar question came up in that group. And one of the speakers, I think, really surprised us all and gifted us all in shifting the question by suggesting that actually we thank MAGA supporters for helping us see what has been true all along, for kind of pulling the veil away of the democratic experiment that was out of integrity already, that that are pulling the veil away from a society that thought itself just when in fact it was deeply unjust. And so in that sense, we should really thank the MAGA movement for calling us to see clearly what has been true in the dynamics and the reality of this moment in which we live, and in a sense waking us up to striving for something better, for something more honest, something that's actually sufficient for the kind of collective story that needs to get scripted in order to carry us forward into a more humane and holistic world. So with that reframe in mind, I ended the conversation last night thinking I never thought I'd say thank God for Donald Trump. But in that frame, I have to say, I have learned a great deal about my own shadow side, about my own complicity in upholding these systems, which are, as Kelly has taught us and showed us, they were so deeply unjust and inequitable at its core. And for me, I should add, and then Kelly, you have to jump in and contribute here. But for me, this is not a democracy versus authoritarianism conversation. For me, there's something much bigger at work here, and that is that we have told ourselves as a global community, particularly in the Western imagination, a story that has brought us to this place, but now is leaving us in the path of matricide, of destroying Mother Earth. And that story is insufficient to create any kind of world that can carry forward. The story that we've been telling ourselves has no future. And so the theological task before us is to reimagine or to create story that does have that care of the common good at its core. St. Thomas Aquinas was the first actually to ever use that phrase, common good. And it was in as a theological foundation for what it means to be good community, that we hold as core to us a empathy for our neighbors, empathy and care for the communities that we're building together. So anyway, I would say maybe we could be thankful, and in that thankfulness for the heartbreak of what we're seeing, it can draw us to compassion. And that's really the space, I think, from which we can create a future together.
Rev, if I can just jump in.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Reverend Doc.
Oh, no, you want to, but I do want to respond if that's okay.
I was trying to jump in and get on the panelist side so I can do some response myself, but you're officially panelist. I was just imitating one. You go ahead.
No, I don't want to stop you, but I do want to push back just a little bit, Reverend Trimble. First of all, I want to say that for the dispossessed and the disinherited, there's never been an illusion about a democracy. To have an illusion is, and this isn't, I'm saying this in general, but to be deluded about the democracy is a privilege for those who are the disinherited, for those who have lived on the underside of injustice and who generationally have, that is the legacy. We have never been disillusioned by the democracy, right? And so, no, I'll tell you how we reconcile with the MAGA folks. To thank the MAGA people who have contributed, who contribute to, because of their own sense, what I've talked about before. I don't blame them. They are suffering on the underside of inequality as well. But, many of them have this sense of race privilege that protects them. And that is a delusion. And will come to recognize that it is a delusion because it's not protecting them in terms of the inequality gaps. But they have the promise of racial exceptionalism and the promise that, we're going to be accepted as a part of this sort of American America's ideal of itself. And that's what we have to push America to live into if it wants to live into this ideal. And I'll say something about that very quickly in a moment. So I push back a little on that, yet I agree that, and then I sort of informed by Reinhold Niebuhr and his irony of America, that I agree that it is indeed the complacency and arrogance of who we are as Americans, that this could never happen to us, and the complacency with our democracy that has humbled us into this place. How do we reconcile with who we're calling the MAGA people? Let's remind ourselves again that they only make up 33 to 36% of our country and of our electorate. So there are a whole lot of other people, as we know from the surveys, that were not identified as MAGA people, that voted for this anti-democracy movement. We have to be clear that it is an anti-democracy movement. People knew what it was when they voted for it. They at least knew that it was a misogynistic, white supremacist, Christian nationalist movement. They knew that. And they aren't MAGA people. They aren't undereducated people, and they voted for it. And the question is, what did they believe they were going to get from it? And typically, these are these people who are the 1%, or represent that, and they have some kind of racial privilege that voted for that. So I don't want to blame it all on the MAGA people, because they only make up 30-some% of the electorate. But how do we reconcile with that group? Well, the only reconciliation I know comes through justice. You create justice. You began to alleviate the inequality gap. And through justice brings reconciliation. I will reconcile with you as we create a more just society. And so as we do that, and our movement toward reconciliation occurs in our fighting together for justice, right? And so how do we get those people there? Well, I'll say this and I promise I'm shutting up. That one of the things that we have to do is, without compromise, tell the truth. and find ways to tell and speak that truth to constituencies that may not get it. And I declare I'm not going to be able to move so easily amongst MAGA people and tell the truth. But some of those of you who share some of the privileges that those people, racial privilege with them or whatever, you need to tell the truth. You need to tell the truth to your community. You need to let them know that your well-being is just as much at stake as these other people who you have scapegoated. And you have allowed others to scapegoat for your condition. So I'm going to shut up there. But to me, the way to reconciliation is truth and justice. Justice and truth, inextricably connected.
I started not let you go first because you said everything I wanted to say, and I would have grabbed it, and I would have sounded just as dope as you sounded if I would have been able to say it, but you beat me to it. I do want to pick up on another part of that though. We don't have a common good. I wish we did have a common good. We could have a common good, but unfortunately, because of extraction from empire, there's really no such thing as a common good. It is a thing of where we have to be intentional about doing justice so that a common good can exist. But that takes work. That takes work. And it's going to take a collective work for all of us to be able to do that. But the first thing we've got to do before we can get to reconciliation, you have to have some conciliation. You got to acknowledge some truths. We got to a point where we were starting to acknowledge truths, and now we see the backlash of society at large acknowledging the truths that America isn't equitable, it isn't just, it isn't, and so now it's this pushback to protect privilege. Well, we've got to, as the church, as people of faith, as communities of faith, as people of conscience, we've got to be intentional about still declaring truth. As I told somebody in a panel earlier this week, this stuff, and I didn't say stuff, isn't normal. Somebody's got to be able to say it. Who best to say it than the church to be able to say it? Who best to say it than people of faith to be able to call us back to center to say, hey, this is normal. It's normal. And until we can get to that point, we'll continue to slide. Somebody said, can we ever be reconciled? Not if we don't start telling the truth, we can't. Keep living in this delusion and lying to ourselves and trying to protect this delusion, then no, we won't reconcile. And we need to be preparing for survival. But if we want to really reconcile, truth has to be told. It's never been just for us. It ain't never been equitable for us. It ain't never been fair for us. We are the first and the worst when it comes down to the harms that's committed in these yet to be United States of America. And somebody has to say that. And none of this stuff that's happening right now is normal by any means necessary. By no means, I mean. Check.
All right. My goodness, we have been sharpening our intellects, expanding our hearts, and aspiring to be church, I think. I like that idea of aspiring to be church. Let it continue from here today. We are now, unfortunately, at the end of our time together, but we will be back next month. We're going to continue to explore that interconnectedness between climate and inequality. We're going to be looking at a Earth Sunday resource put out by Creation Justice Ministries. The title of our webinar next month is going to be Transformative Faith in Toxic Times. We're going to be looking to transformative faith, whether it's mountaintop removal. We're going to be looking at transformative faith in New Orleans, where they're wrestling with storms and hurricanes. All that will be next month. We welcome you back. Look forward to it. Thank you to our panelists for this terrific time together. I'm looking forward to this being on YouTube so I can share it with others. I think we're going to put this in sort of some of our trainings. It was so good on that interconnected injustices that we're facing today. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. God bless each of you. And thank you for being with us today.